Okay, so now that we've looked at, or at least reviewed the key concepts, namely the mode of production, means of production, relations of production, and introduced another key concept, the key concept of class and the specific divisions of class that existed under the emerging capitalist mode of production. Now what we're going to do is look at the intellectual background of this emerging system. And to understand that, we have to look at the foundations of liberal thought. And we're going to look at three philosophers or theorists: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Adam Smith. And what you have to understand, what most of these, or at least all of them, have in common is what a lot of what liberalism is, or at least the foundations of liberal thought. It's the secularization of authority. Under feudalism and what had existed prior to the emergence of liberalism was this idea that authority could only come from a divine being. In the Christian context, it was God, right? If we looked at the role of the Catholic Church under the feudal system, aside from being large property owners in its own right, the Catholic Church, and in some ways later the Protestant Church, at least in England, existed to justify the system as it existed, right? So the king was the king because he was chosen by God by virtue of the accident of birth, right? Your Lord was the Lord because God willed it so. You were a peasant because that's what God wanted. So in the 17th century, what emerges first with Thomas Hobbes is the secularization of that authority. Why should you obey or have allegiance to a particular authority if not for divine reasons? What reason was there? And why should everybody obey a sovereign in this case? So what you have to understand about all these theorists is that they exist in a particular historical context, right? These, as much as there are ideas within these books that are still cited today and in many ways still used to justify the system that we live under, which is for the most part liberal democratic capitalism, they're written at a specific time and place. And often people like to use and cite passages from these books out of context, right? You have to understand the context under which they are written. So if we look first at Thomas Hobbes, who is in many ways regarded as the father of liberalism or liberal thought, what he's reacting to is the English Civil War, which devastated the English countryside, turned neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend, as civil wars do. In many ways, civil wars are more devastating than wars between nations and wars between countries because it's difficult to tell who the enemy is. And it tears people apart. It tears families apart. It created a kind of chaos. It's something in the book The Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes calls this kind of state of nature. And for those of you that have read Hobbes or studied Western philosophy will understand a little bit about what I'm talking about. So I'll give you a little bit more into his thinking. So Thomas Hobbes argues that prior to a kind of civil society, there existed a state of nature. And in that state of nature was the war of all against all. Everybody existed as a sovereign entity, which means everybody had the right to use violence against one another. And that's often how disputes were settled. In the absence of a larger or a higher authority, people were constantly fighting one another. So this is the key justification for Thomas Hobbes as to why you should have an authority. It's not because God wants it so. It's because it's in everybody's interest to have an authority. So the key thing that Thomas Hobbes says has to happen in order for this kind of liberal authority to exist is everybody has to surrender this sort of right of absolute freedom. But everybody has to do it at the same time, right? Just like with taxes. You only partly pay your taxes because everybody does. If lots of people stopped paying them, most people would stop paying them, right? So this is what we're getting at. Key here is that sovereignty derives from the ruled. Even if they surrender their sovereignty to an all-powerful government, it doesn't have to necessarily be democratic, but the idea is there has to be a single authority or a leviathan, to use Thomas Hobbes' terminology, so that everybody exists in relation to this Leviathan essentially the same, right? The Leviathan is the one that has a monopoly on violence and can use violence, right? Disputes then within that particular society are settled through the emergence of civil society. What was key to Thomas Hobbes was this idea of a social contract, right? That there was a social contract between the people who were ruled and the entity that ruled over them. This is why everybody was willing to surrender their absolute freedom or their right to violence, because there was a contract. Once you surrendered it, it was the job of the sovereign, the Leviathan, to protect the people who had surrendered the right to absolute authority and absolute violence. in this case. Now, you can kind of understand why this would be appealing to Hobbes. After he just lived through the chaos of the English Civil War, the idea of a stable, all-powerful authority is fairly attractive when you think about it. Often what happened in not just England, but other parts of Europe, there were constant sort of dynastic disputes over who had the right to rule, who had the better claim to be king, which part of the government is where the sort of all power lied. But under Hobbes, he's making a liberal argument, right? That you govern at the consent of the governed, right? It's not necessarily a democracy, and this is key. For Thomas Hobbes, the state isn't necessarily democratic, so long as it treats everybody the same. So the social contract that exists basically justifies why you have a ruler and also why you obey that ruler, right? It's not about the divine right of kings. It's in your interest to do it, because if you don't, what would be left is chaos. Now, how does this relate specifically to capitalism? Right? Other than it creates a kind of state that is sort of ideal in shepherding this new system of commercial capitalism along. But if we go back to one of Thomas Hobbes' famous quotes, when he talks about the problem with the state of nature or chaos, he says, "In such condition, there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea, no commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no amount of time, no arts, no letters, no society, which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." So the idea is that under this chaotic system, you couldn't get the flourishing of manufacturing and wealth and these kinds of things, right? So this is where Thomas Hobbes is key in the emergence of liberal thought. Now, next, of course, is John Locke. Now, John Locke, in many ways, is probably one of the most important, perhaps the most important sort of liberal philosopher of the late 17th, early 18th century. Again, most of you probably, at least when you took this course, were thinking more in terms of Adam Smith, and I'll talk about him in a minute. And of course, he is incredibly important. But Locke is important specifically because he provides a really sort of interesting and essential intellectual foundation and justification for what will become capitalism. His ideas of property specifically dovetail with this emerging capitalist system in interesting ways. So in a way, Locke provided the kind of deeper underlying philosophical foundations that would allow capitalism to flourish. And as I said, namely, his definition of property and how to acquire it. Indeed, if both of them were sort of writing in the shadow of the English Civil War, right? John Locke's writing in the 1660s and 70s and this kind of thing, right? It's not that long after the English Civil Wars of the 30s and 40s. But what is key for Locke is his theory of property. And specifically, he has what we call a labor theory of property, which on the one hand sounds really good, and in many ways it is. He's trying to find a more democratic means to justify property, as opposed to, and again, this gets to the idea that all sort of these theorists of liberal thought were basically secularizing, not only just authority in the case of Thomas Hobbes, but legal rights, that legal rights don't exist simply because they were given down by God or time immemorial, but there is a specific and secular and political justification for these legal rights. In the case of Locke, the most important thing is the legal right to property and how one acquires it. So in some ways, he's offering a more democratic view of property. And what I mean by the labor theory of property is something that emerged in the late 17th century and basically was invented by Locke, was this idea of improvement. So Locke's justification for property was basically putting your labor into land, right? So for example, John Locke would argue that your right to a specific parcel or tract of land should be based not on some historical or feudal right that's been passed down for generation and generation, but whether or not you would improve that land. Now, this is key, right? So the justification for private property in the case of Locke is improvement, right? I have title to your land because I am going to improve it in ways that you are not. Now, what this does, it also encourages greater productivity, right? Because if I'm just sitting on something, in this case land or other forms of property, and I'm not doing anything with it, I should get out of the way and make way for somebody who will develop it. Now, on the one hand, this could be more democratic because it means that if you have an idea or you intend to improve a specific parcel of land, then it could potentially make a claim for why you should own that land. Now, you can imagine, though, what this does in the particular time and place in which it was written, right? If we're talking the late 17th century, we're also talking the beginning, and in many ways it had been underway for a few decades now, of British colonialism or English colonialism, specifically in North America, but it could also apply to the concept of colonial imperialism everywhere. And often what Locke was used to justify specifically was the expropriation and dispossession of indigenous peoples from their land in the Americas. Now, you can probably see where I'm going with this, right? If the definition of property is based on whether or not you'll improve it, then you can see how settlers in the Americas, specifically the territory that would eventually become the United States, used this to justify their dispossession of indigenous peoples. Their argument was, well, they're not being productive with the land, and this settler is arguing, well, I will therefore be more productive, therefore it is mine, right? Now, of course, it's not necessarily adjudicated through courts. It was often done violently, but it provides this intellectual foundation upon which the English settlers could justify their dispossession of land that wasn't theirs, right? So this is why it's so important. It's the idea that all property and the right to property should be based on whether or not you will make that property more productive. And also it provides a convenient justification for colonial imperialism in this case. Okay. So the third theorist that we're going to look at here, and one that many of you are sort of already a little bit familiar with, is of course Adam Smith. Now Adam Smith publishes his famous work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes Concerning the Wealth of Nations in 1776. And by a kind of serendipity of history, it is the same year that the United States declares its independence from Great Britain. Now, like the other philosophers, Adam Smith is of course a product of his time. He's reacting against the forces that exist and sort of the context of his time. Now, the key things that you have to understand about Adam Smith and his role in the emergence and justification of what will become the capitalist mode of production is the way that he saw history. Now, Adam Smith and a lot of the other liberal philosophers, but especially Adam Smith, understood history as being driven by the expansion of markets, right? So if Adam Smith were to go back and look at our lecture on the crisis of feudalism and its transition to capitalism, he would place the prime mover. If you remember when I talked about, we can talk about all these reasons that contributed to the emergence of capitalism, but there was always this question that existed. What was the prime mover? Adam Smith would focus on the expansion of markets. That is not only the prime mover in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, but he would argue is the prime mover of history itself. And this is why Adam Smith is so important to the history of not only economics, but history in general. Now, the other key thing that we have to understand about Adam Smith, at least from a more foundational point of view, and I'll get into a more sort of technical point of view in a minute, is the idea that if Thomas Hobbes secularized authority, Adam Smith was secularizing behavior, right? So what he did was he argued that the acquisition of goods, the pursuit of private wealth, right, or the maximization of one's own wealth to one's own interest, was a virtue in and of itself. It had nothing to do with God. It was your civic virtue to pursue your own interest and to try to maximize your wealth. Well, why did he argue this? So a lot of what he's arguing is this sort of theory of every man for itself, right? It's something that often supporters of capitalism argue is the sort of defining feature of it, and also they see as one of the best features of capitalism, right? It leads to innovation. Now, what Smith is arguing is that this is a virtue, and the reason it's a virtue, and this is what he's getting at about when he says the wealth of nations, is that if everybody in society is sort of pursuing their own self-interest to maximize their wealth and sort of happiness, well, then the country as a whole will produce more wealth. And because it produces more wealth, then that country or that state or that society will be able to take care of people who perhaps aren't as successful in pursuing their own interest and maximizing their wealth. And this is sort of key. And what I was getting at when I was talking about how people like Adam Smith are often quoted and referenced selectively. Adam Smith is often invoked by supporters of capitalism to argue that, well, yeah, this is the foundation of economic theory, which is the idea that every man for themselves is actually the best system. But what they often forget is what Adam Smith was arguing and suggesting with that was it was a means to an end. It was not an end in and of itself. Often now, people think of this acquisition of private property, the acquisition of wealth, as an end in and of itself. But what Smith is saying is it's actually a means to an end, right? You should pursue your own interest. And if everybody's pursuing their own interest in creating wealth, the nation will have more wealth to take care of its possibly most vulnerable. Right? So it wasn't this kind of market fundamentalism in and of itself. It served a higher purpose. The free market was a virtue because it led to more wealth. It could take care of the most vulnerable members of society. The other key factors that you have to understand about Adam Smith is he's sort of the first theorist to talk about the division of labor. Last class and the class before, we looked at how merchants started dividing labor and rationalizing production. Well, Adam Smith starts to see this, and he argues that this is actually one of the ways that you can maximize wealth in a society by being more productive. And the way you be more productive is to create a division of labor. Again, we have to think of Adam Smith as existing within his own time and place. Now, let's sum up a little bit here if we go to the next slide. So what you need to understand about liberalism is sort of four things. One, it tended to minimize the role of violence in early capitalism, and it does this in kind of two ways. One, what Hobbes is doing is he's trying to create a society in which violence is used as little as possible, right? But at the same time, often he missed a lot of the ways that violence still persisted within early capitalism, right? One of the key things that I mentioned a few lectures ago was when a lot of these peasants were dispossessed, or as Smith would argue, liberated from the land, this is when you got the rise of vagrancy laws. And these laws were enforced violently. And the reason you got the rise of these laws was to ensure that these sort of masterless or landless men would not become a menace to society. It also minimized growing inequality, right? Now, it does this in different ways. Now, when it talks about minimizing growing inequality, often what it's talking about is not so much equality in terms of wealth, but equality in terms of politics and sort of legal equality. And we'll see more of this when we look at the liberal democratic revolutions after the break in the second half of the semester. But it's this idea that you have growing equality in terms of legal status, although not completely, but a growing inequality in terms of social and class status. Liberalism tends to see people or see the world as kind of flat. It often minimizes the advantages that people are born into, or at least doesn't see them as a problem. Which brings us to our next point. Society is atomized individuals motivated by self-interest, searching for ever greater opportunity and increased liberty. Now, this speaks to what we're talking about with Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith, as much as he sees self-interest as a virtue, does not necessarily think people should think of themselves as members of a specific class. They need to think of themselves as individuals. Right? That the only relation and division that matters is between the state and everybody else, right? And we can see that going from Hobbes, Locke, and everywhere else. It also sort of minimizes, if we get back to the role of violence, if we think of John Locke, right? On the one hand, the way that he defines property in the case of England might minimize violence because these disputes are settled through the courts. But in the case of colonialism and imperial expansion, even though his theory of property is used to justify the dispossession of land, they weren't just asked to leave, of course. The dispossession of indigenous peoples in the Americas was done at the barrel of a gun, and tremendously violent. So even though it minimizes the role of violence within the home country, in this case England, in many ways it justifies greater violence in the colonial society. And of course, the last thing to think of here is markets as the motor of history. It is the key determinant of human action. And this is a lot of what Adam Smith was arguing, that everything should be mediated through a market. And this is often what defines capitalism, that capitalism is a market society in which every relationship between people is mediated through some type of market. Okay, so this is sort of the liberal foundations of capitalism, and it's sort of the intellectual foundations that justify capitalism. And now what we're going to look at is some alternatives to liberalism, or at least ideas that do not justify capitalism, but critique it.